And welcome back to another video here on Wristwatch Revival. I'm Marshall. Thanks so much for coming along. This time around, we've got a really sweet Omega Seamaster 30. And I love these old watches. They're actually really nice. You can see this one's got a little bit of missing lume on one of the hands. And if you look closely, you can also see the seconds hand. It feels like it's not running right for some reason, but these are beautiful. This one was from 1962, which is actually the year that this model came out. These are time only, as you can see, but they're gorgeous. They're super simple, and I love these. You can get them on eBay for a reasonable price as well to get you into vintage watches if you're looking to get into that. And today, we're going to be, you can see that seconds hand just doesn't look like it's running right. But yeah, we're going to be getting into this thing and see what's going on the inside, and then we're going to take it apart, see if there's any issues, clean it, get it all oiled up, and put it back together to see if we can't get it running right. So first things first, let's take a look inside, and oh my God. This is an Omega caliber 286 movement, which is a pretty simple movement all told, but it's beautiful. I love this movement. It's brass, as you can see, it's absolutely gorgeous inside. And it's a shame that this thing has the solid case back, because I love the way this movement looks in this watch. We're going to put it on the microscope now and take a closer look, and you can see that actually this thing's really clean. This watch was fairly recently serviced, and you can tell, you know, oftentimes you get into a vintage watch like this and it's just a mess of dirt and dried on oil. This one looks like it's in beautiful running condition. And we'll find that out in a minute. We're going to put it on the time grapher to see what kind of time it's seen, and maybe if we can see what's going on with that. And there we go. There's a caliber 286 movement. You can see there's maybe some stuff on one of the wheels. It probably could use a little bit of a clean, but overall, this is way better than you would expect from an older watch like this. Seriously, way better. And yeah, it's always cool to get it on the microscope as well. So let's do the next thing though and put it on the time grapher. And this is just a machine that is going to measure different aspects of how it keeps time. So if you look along the top, you'll see rate, amplitude, beat error, and parameters. So the rate is its seconds per day that it's either gaining or losing. And this one's gaining quite a bit, plus 90. So a minute and a half a day it's gaining, it looks like. And then the amplitude is basically, it's how much the balance travels. So you want it to travel more, generally speaking, and 240 is okay. Then there's the beat error, which is if it's not traveling the same distance in both directions, and then the rest is just information about it. So first things first, we need to take off the watch band here, and that's a pretty easy deal. These are basically all using spring bars these days. And yeah, so we'll get into this. And again, we've got this gorgeous movement in here. This watch beats at 18,000 beats per hour, which is pretty standard for this time frame. First things first, of course, are these case clamps. So these are what hold the movement to the side of the case and make sure that everything's flush with the front of the case. And they're just a simple little piece of step metal on a screw. And next thing we need to do in order to take the movement out of the case is to remove the winding stem. So we just, the setting lever screw there, I just loosen it up, and then the stem comes right out. And then the movement and the dial and stuff should fall right out of the case here. And that's what they do. This dial's in pretty good shape, actually, considering its age. It is beat up, though. You can see some of the laminate has come off of it a little bit here and there, and it's got some dirt. Also, the 12 o'clock marker looks like it's a little uneven, but whatever. This thing's old, and I love it. So now we have to put the winding stem back in, and the reason that we do this is because we need to take the hands off. And it's much easier to do so if we just get the hands sort of roughly lined up with each other so we can take them all off at once, rather than having them at different angles and stuff. Because my preferred tool to do this are these little hand levers. And in order to protect the dial, I'll just put a piece of plastic bag over it and then grab these little hand levers. And this makes it really easy. It just pops the hands off really simply. And using that plastic is just a little bit of insurance. The hand levers are actually polished metal on the bottom so that they don't scratch, but you know, you can never be too safe, and it just takes half a second to put the plastic on there. So there's the minute, hour, and seconds hand all coming off. And with those out of the way, we need to get the dial off of this watch. And usually you'll find that if you look along the sides, there it is. The watch will have these dial screws that are, they put some type of pressure on the feet of the dial to keep it on there. And the dial comes off actually quite easily once you've loosened, or in our case, we actually took out one of those screws, which you don't really need to do. But so there we go, dial away. And now we get a look at the motion works and the keyless works. That's both appear on this side of the watch movement. And as you can see, there's some fairly extensive scratching on here as well. I always wonder how this type of stuff happens. I mean, this watch has been around for a really long time, but it is pretty scratched up when you when you look at it. You think, well, this thing's been in a case the whole time, right? Like nobody was scratching this. Now we need to remove the Canon pinion, and I've got this little Canon pinion remover tool that I got off of eBay. I actually restored this tool as well. It was kind of beat up. And I put a new handle, a new sort of thumb guard on the back, and I cleaned it up and put it through actually the same thing. That's the Canon pinion, by the way, safely removed. I put it through the ultrasonic cleaner and then re-lubricated it as well. Now this is a really key point here. So the mainspring, which powers the whole watch, is underneath that larger gear that I'm unwinding here. And so what I'm doing is I'm pulling away the click. That's that little thing that the tweezers are on. That's what stops it from unwinding all at once. And I'm carefully unwinding it using my fingers and the winding crown. And the idea here is to take all the power out of the watch so that there's nothing under tension when we go to take it apart. And as you'll see, the watch will stop here in just a second as it runs out of juice in there. It comes to a nice stop. So the first thing that I like to do, and that I was taught to do by Mark Lovick over at the Watch Repair channel, which, by the way, everything I've learned basically comes from Mark. I've taken his classes and watched all of his videos, and he's kind of my hero for this stuff, so I'll talk about him quite a bit. And if you have not had a chance to check out the Watch Repair channel, you're missing out, and you should definitely go over there and check it out. But what he recommends is to take the balance off first of the kind of, going train of wheels and all that stuff. And this is primarily to keep it safe, right? Because it is the most delicate part, and to just take it off and get it out of the way so that we're not banging into the balance spring or doing anything else, especially for somebody like me, because I'm still learning, right? This is a hobby of mine and something that I've picked up and I really enjoy doing, but I'm by no means an expert at this. I don't get paid for it. I haven't taken, the 3 years of classes or whatever. I'm learning. And so that means that it's important for me to try to give myself safeguards, right? So that I don't damage stuff, because yeah, I'm still figuring it all out. So now we're going to take off the pallet bridge here. So this is held on by 2 screws. And then you can see there's a nice ruby jewel there that goes over the pallet fork. And you can see as I pull this away that the pallet fork is revealed, and that's it right there. So I'll just take this out and set it aside. You can see I use one of these little parts trays to kind of keep everything organized. Now I want to take out the winding screw once again. And then this watch is kind of interesting. It's got this little kind of extra bridge on the top. And I'm going to go ahead and take that off first because it's kind of on top of the bridge that I actually want to get to. And this is it right here. And it kind of pops away. And if you look, there's a jewel on the top there. And then there's kind of this extended pivot right here, this thing. And that looks, I believe that runs the second sand, the running second sand. So that could be part of the reason why we get that kind of weird jaggedy movement on it. And I'll be paying attention to that when I clean it. And then there's this little, I don't know what that thing does, to be honest. but I do need to remove it. I know that. So there it goes. And then there's this sort of double wheel thing. So down below, there's like the third wheel, I think, in the normal train of wheels, but it has a pivot that goes up to a wheel up above, which again, I think runs the seconds. But this is common for me, which is that I don't know how to remove that part. And I don't want to start forcing things apart. So I'm just going to leave it on there for now and kind of address it in a minute. In the meantime, I'm going to take off, well, I'm going to attempt to take off the screw here. And this is the part that goes on top of the barrel so that when you wind it, it actually winds up the spring underneath. And it has a little bit of dirt on it, so probably could use a cleaning. But again, this movement looks very, very good, especially compared to other vintage watches that I've gotten, especially neglected ones. I mean, it gets ugly in there. Like, it makes you wonder how that much dirt and oil and stuff actually get in there, but it does. So here's the click. And then there's this little tiny wire spring right here that we need to take out. That's the Clique Spring. So this is the ratchet wheel. This is actually when you wind a watch, it actually ultimately turns this on the top. And then when that turns, it turns the one that I already took off on the left that's on top of the barrel there. And that's what winds the watch. And this one actually has two small screws that holds it in place. And then it's a little awkward because it's underneath that one that I don't know how to take off. So I have to kind of work around it a little bit. It's kind of a pain. Ugh, there we go. But it seems to come off okay. And that leaves us trying to take off, because of that wheel once again, I'm going to take off the train wheel bridge. So this is the bridge that kind of is over the main part of the watch, the wheels, the thing that you think of when you think of the inside of a watch. So just being very gentle here to take this off, because the train wheels have delicate pivots on them, right? Really little narrow things. And I just want to make sure that I don't jam them too much here. So there, that comes off actually pretty cleanly. And there's that double wheel that I don't know how to take apart. And so I either have to figure it out or just leave them connected and just clean it like that. I think that's also probably fine. And there, that's the escape wheel. So that's the last of that. Now I need to take off the barrel bridge, and that goes over the barrel as you might expect. And it's held on by these 3 screws. I always look at the screw when I take it off just to make sure. This one's interesting because that's actually the setting lever screw, which doesn't hold it down, but it's nice to take it off because it's a tall screw and it kind of makes it harder to take it off, but it's not actually one that's holding it in place, which is kind of interesting. So here comes the barrel bridge. It's quite a big bridge. And there we go. Oop. And then underneath, now I can take off the center wheel. That's the one that goes through to the barrel arbor, or through the Canon pinion that we took off earlier. And there's the barrel coming out. That leaves a little bit left here. This is the bottom part of what we call the keyless works. So this is the way that you set and wind the watch, and how you go from setting it to winding it by pulling out the crown. And then this is the other side of that, the sort of the rest of the setting and keyless work here. And yeah, these scratches. Look at those scratches. How does that happen? I always wonder. So this is the setting lever spring. It also kind of holds everything down, kind of like a bridge does. And I'll just go ahead and get underneath here and just release any tension on it. And I like to hold it down with pegwood just so it doesn't go flying. And we'll set that aside. And then underneath, these two wheels just set the time. So when it's in the setting position, it takes you turning the crown and it turns it into the hands turning. That's the actual setting lever, or what is that stupid thing called? Setting lever? Yeah, I think so. And this is what we call the yoke and the yoke spring. And yoke springs do this. I try to prevent it, but I did end up finding it. But I try to prevent it with the pegwood, but sometimes I screw it up and it goes flying anyway. And then the yoke comes out. And this is actually quite close to being fully disassembled. Really, the last task here is to get the mainspring out of the barrel. And the barrel's made up of 3 parts. It's the main part of the barrel, and then the barrel lid, which I'm going to take off right here. That's the barrel lid there. And then the barrel arbor inside is that little metal post in between. And of course, the spring as well. So I'm going to take off the barrel arbor. That goes away. And now there's the very tricky task of getting the spring out. And the thing is, if all you cared about was getting the spring out, you could do it quite easily. It just would be vaguely dangerous and pretty bad for the spring. So instead, you have to do it very carefully so that it doesn't go flying out, because that's not good for you or the spring. So what you like to do is this. You sort of walk it out one little half turn at a time until the whole entire spring is out of that thing. And it's crazy how much spring fits in there. But you have to remember that spring, which you can see right there in the middle, that actually runs the entire watch. Any function on your watch is run by that long metal spring there. And that's just how that works. So there it is, the watch fully disassembled and ready for cleaning. And we'll see what's going on with it. All right, everything back and ready to be reassembled. The first thing I noticed, though, was the mainspring. You can see it has this weird bend in it. It is not supposed to look like that. And while it probably would still work, I decided just to get a new one for this movement. So this is what a new mainspring looks like when it comes. And it comes in a little packet, and it's got this metal ring around it that's silver on the back and some color on the top. And basically, it's pretty easy. You just put it into the mainspring barrel. That's it. But yeah, I don't know. They don't cost that much. And also, they are the type of item that can kind of wear out over time, where they still work, but they don't work as well as they could or should. So I just decided to get a new one. And the way that these work is you put the color up, and then you just push them into the barrel, carefully-ish. And there we go. So that's all ready to go. Now we can put the barrel arbor in. That's, of course, the part that actually engages with the spring itself and turns when you wind the watch. And there's actually a little hook on the side of it that needs to engage with the inner part of the spring, which has a little hole to kind of grab it. So I just get that engaged. And then I can put the cap on like this. And just make sure this is secured properly, and it's good to go. So the barrel is all ready, and with that, we can take the movement itself and start getting this thing back together. So the first things first, we're going to do the train of wheels. And this is the escape wheel going on. And the fourth wheel. And you can see that I skipped that other wheel there because remember, this is the one that has that kind of extension onto the top part. And it's actually a pretty clean way to do this. I still need to figure out a way to separate these two, or for that matter, to get them back together. I don't know what tool I need to separate them, and I haven't figured it out quite yet. And you can see I'm just using a piece of pegwood to just make sure that this bridge is properly in place and that the wheels will be able to spin freely here to make sure I know that they're in the pivots are in their jewels that they're supposed to be in, and that it can go. And I usually try to be very careful with that part, because if you've ever seen a pivot on one of these wheels, it's minuscule. I mean, it's just the thinnest little piece of metal. And while it is steel or whatever, it's pretty tough. We really wouldn't take much to bend or break. And so what I'll usually do is kind of gently get the bridge on, and then what I'll do here is I'll screw this down, but not all the way. Just sort of placeholder style, where it's there, but it's not actually tight. And then I'll check it again like this and make sure that the train is still spinning freely, so that I know for sure that I'm not tightening down on one of those pivots and bending it. And then once again, just one last check to make sure that it's spinning. Yeah, it looks pretty good. So now we can put the barrel in. And I'm just oiling the train wheel pivots here. I'm using a very thin synthetic oil called Mobius 9010. And this is actually kind of somewhat tricky work, because you need to put such a small amount of oil on. It's actually hard to kind of see. And here I'm using a slightly thicker oil, also synthetic, called HP 1300, also from Mobius. Mobius is just a company that makes oils. And now we can put the barrel bridge in place. Now, this is a little bit tricky, as you can see, because the top of that bridge needs to go on that main wheel in the middle, but underneath that wheel that's sort of sticking up. And again, being an amateur at this kind of shows, because, ideally you would take that other wheel off and have free access to that without having to have it touch that wheel. In my case, since I don't know how to do that yet, I just was careful, right? I'm not just going to jam it in there and break off some teeth or bend it up or whatever, but it's a little more on the you do what you got to do mode, rather than knowing for sure that you did it properly. And here's another example of that. If that wheel was just out of the way, then I could just easily put the top of the ratchet wheel in there, but yeah, what are you or the crown wheel, excuse me, but what are you going to do? I'll figure it out at some point, but for me, it's kind of like if it's not a deal breaker, I'll just continue on and try to get the job done the best that I can. Now, if that was in the way to an extent that I couldn't, then of course I'd have to stop and really figure it out. So now I'm just going to put the crown wheel in place here with these two little tiny screws. These are not the smallest screws on this movement, but they're on the short list. And And now we can get working on the other side there. So the first thing that I want to do is get the Clique Spring in place. And this is that weird little spring that's got that kind of normal spring look with the loop, but then it has that circle and it kind of pokes up. And so yeah, I'm just using a piece of pegwood to try to kind of hold it down, but it's a little finicky, but there we go. Not too bad. And that means that we can now put the click into place. Okay. Don't want to over tighten that one, as that screw is actually on a post. So as you can see, it still allows the click to rotate freely. Also, I figure I should probably put the screws to keep the barrel bridge in place while I'm at it. I mean, it's not really the end of the world to not have put those in yet, but normally you would just do that right away. Okay, so I can make sure that the crown wheel is spinning freely and that the click is all doing the action that we hope from it. And then I can put the ratchet wheel in place. So when you turn your winder on a watch, that's the part right there that actually ends up getting turned. And then since you see that square part in the middle, that engages with the top of the barrel arbor, that little thing that we put in the middle of the barrel. And then it actually turns the spring inside that barrel. And then when the spring unwinds, so does the barrel. And that is what, and the barrel has gears on the bottom of it, if you noticed, and that engages with the wheels as they go all the way down. So it's actually fairly straightforward. It's just a little weird. Like, it's obviously, it's kind of genius how people have figured this stuff out, especially when this stuff was figured out. This type of movement is called a Swiss lever escapement, and it's almost all the types of watches that you'll see are Swiss lever escapement watches these days. There are a few different types of escapements that you can use, but the Swiss companies don't, outside of Omega, which interestingly, this is actually also an Omega, but before the time. Now you will occasionally find what they call a coaxial escapement, which was developed by a very famous and noteworthy watchmaker named George Daniels from England. And he kind of shopped his new way to do it around to a bunch of the Swiss companies for almost 20 years before one of them finally took him up on it. It actually ended up being Omega. And so they use the coaxial escapement quite often, but like 99% of mechanical watches that you grab have a Swiss lever escapement. I put the Canon pinion back on there, and I had that special tool to take it off, but to put it back on, you just press it on. It's what they call friction fit, which just means it's simply held on by friction. So now we can move to the keyless work. This is the way that you wind up your watch and also how you set it. And so I'm putting a little bit of grease on the sliding clutch right there, and the sliding pinion as well. And this is always kind of a tricky part, because that piece that I'm putting on there actually gets screwed onto through the other side. So it's very tricky because you want to set this part on, but then you need to kind of hold it. So what I'll do is put my finger on it and then screw it in from the other side. And there, now it's in place, and I can move forward with putting the watch together. So this is a sliding clutch here, and the sliding pinion is behind it. And basically those two have the stem that you wind the watch through go through it. and it'll have two settings. One setting will be it winds up the watch, and then another setting, if you pull out the winding crown just a little bit, will be for setting the hands. And I'm going to put a couple of wheels on there, and those wheels are there so that you can set the watch. This is what's called the yoke. And if you see that stuff I'm putting on, it's just a little bit of grease just to let it slide freely and not score. All right, that looks good. Now this is the Yoke Spring. And again, I'm going to bust out the pegwood here because, as we saw before, these things can go flying. And they stick to your clothes, and yeah, I have yet to actually never find one of these, but I have lost them for longer period of time than I'm comfortable with. So I try to be careful with them, but they are just, I mean, well, they're springs, right? They're supposed to do that. And this is the last spring that we have to put on for the keyless works. And it also acts as kind of a bridge. You can see it's got a couple of posts there that kind of hold it in place, and it sort of holds everything together, but also that long arm along the bottom with the little funny end on it does act as a spring, and so I'll engage that here. And give it a quick test. So now I can, that's in the setting position. So that's to make sure that it would actually set the hands on the watch. And then a wind. So now we can finish up with the escapement. And this, of course, is what regulates the actual timekeeping. That thing's called the pallet fork. And it engages with the escape wheel there. There we go. And there's a little bridge for the pallet fork. Interestingly, you don't have to lubricate that pallet fork. In fact, it's meant not to be. Lubricants degrade over time, and this is a very, very high action part of the watch. It's basically going back and forth. Thousands of times per hour, so it's designed to not need it. There's also kind of an interesting thing with it where lubricant is much more useful if something is spinning continually, where the pallet fork actually doesn't spin, it just goes back and forth a little bit, and that reduces the need for oil by quite a bit. So you can get away with it. And now there should be some tension on that so that when I go back and forth, there you go, it kind of lets go and clicks over to the next thing. And that brings us to the most important part of the watch probably, which is the balance. This is the whole balance assembly with the balance wheel, the hairspring or balance spring as well. And this is also the moment when we get to find out if this thing's going to run. So I just got to get those pivot holes lined up properly before we start to push it down. And there we go. It's running. Love to see that. Oh, that's the best part of doing any of this stuff, seriously, is when it fires right back up like that. Feels so good. It's really what makes it fun. Looks like it's cruising along pretty good too. So we need to oil a little bit more. So I figured I'd put it on the microscope so that you can see. And of course, I'm not very good at this. And it's exasperated a little bit by the fact that we're on the microscope. But you can at least get a feel for how much oil is being put in. I mean, that thing is absolutely tiny. And it's just that little tiny bit of oil. You don't even fill up that little cup it's actually just much less than that. So you can see here once again how much oil I'm actually putting in, and that's even a bit on the much side there. So now this part's extra important and extra finicky. So we need to clean and oil the jewels that are on the balance. So the top and the bottom of the balance have special jewel setups with multiple things going on. First things first, there's that little spring that I just pulled out of the way. That's an Inca block or an anti-shock spring, that little thing right there. And what that does is if you drop a watch that has this, it allows it to move around a little bit. The pivots on the actual balance to move and go up and down a little bit rather than snapping off, which old watches did. And then it also has this. It has a jewel assembly, which has a cap jewel, which I'm putting a little bit of oil on right there. And then the jewel setting up above it, you can see that little hole where the pivot goes through. And the top of it is this cap jewel, which limits how far up and down the pivot can go. And I'm trying to get just a little bit of oil onto the head of it. And well, I'll be honest with you, that's a bit too much. I wouldn't call it a disaster, but that's more than I'd like. But like I said, still learning. So I guess for now, that's about the best I can do. When I wash the watches, I put them through the washer, which with these jewels still intact, meaning that they don't actually get cleaned. So what I did there is very carefully undo the setting, take it out, put it in some fluid that cleans it, and then re-oil it. And now I can just put the whole setting right back in, and it's all oiled up and ready to go. And so that's what I'm doing here. I'm just gonna, there we go, get this setting back in there, and then I have to carefully get the spring here back on as well. And of course, these things are just absolutely minuscule. And normally I do this on a microscope, and that's what I'm doing here. The only difference is that I have to do it sort of off of a camera screen because I'm recording it, which does make it a little bit more difficult than just looking through the viewfinder on the microscope. But maybe I'll get used to it. So there we go. And now this is the bottom. So this is the same thing that we had before, but it's just the bottom jewel. And it's the same setup. It has a cap jewel and a setting, and we need to remove it from the case by first loosening up this little spring and freeing it. And then what I do is I actually take a little piece of Rodico. And Rodico is just this sticky kind of putty stuff that you can use to clean stuff up or move stuff or hold stuff. And in this case, it actually took out the cap jewel by itself, but I can still just get in there and get the other jewel setting. And then once again, I need to go through this song and dance of trying to get just the right amount of oil on this thing. And it's very, very tricky because it's such a small amount. And it doesn't necessarily want to come off the tip of the oiler in kind of the way that you hope it will. Like there, I was actually touching the jewel and it just refused to move. And now I touch it and, well, once again, it's a bit too much. I'd prefer to have about 10 to 15% less oil than that on it. But again, you know, I'm still trying to get good at this. So in many ways, you're watching me learn and practice as we go. And you know, sometimes I do have to do it 2 or 3 times because I'm really not happy with how it looked. And that one, like I said, was, I think, acceptable, but not really perfect. And back into the watch it goes. And then we can just sort of carefully close the Inca block setting, and then that's job done for that. Yeah, before these things were invented, if somebody dropped their watch, it almost broke every time. So those things are actually really great. All right, so watch is still running well, but as you can see, it doesn't quite look right because it doesn't have a dial or hands or a case or anything like that. So let's get that rolling. That's actually right down the stretch here for us as well. So we can start reassembling this thing. And there's the dial. And the dial feet just go in. There's a hole specifically for the dial feet. And then if you remember from when we took it apart, the screws are right there. on the edge. So there's one of them. And then the other one's right here. And all these do is just push up against the little dial feet and just put some pressure on them so that it doesn't move. That's it. They're really simple. Now we can put the hands on. And so this is a time-only watch, meaning it doesn't have a date or any other functions. So the way we do this is I'll just put the hour hand kind of wherever. It doesn't really matter what setting it's on, because then I can use the setting position on the winding crown there to get it right to midnight. Like I want it to be dead on 12. And then what I can do is I can take the minute hand here and I can line it up really on whichever hour I want. Again, because there's no calendar on this watch, I can just do it wherever. I decide just to go ahead and do it at 12, but it is important that I get this, you know, basically right on 12, because if it's not, then it'll be off by that much for every hour, which, as you can imagine, would be quite annoying. So let's see how I got it. Yeah, that looks pretty good. I'm pretty happy with that. And then, of course, there's also the running seconds hand, which is what that middle extra gear that I kept talking about not being able to remove. That's what this is. That's what that gear is doing, is running this right here, this running seconds hand. And just a quick press with the hand tool. And then I can kind of give it more of a check here. And it looks like none of the hands are fouling each other. There's no touching there, no friction. It's not touching up against any of the hour indices. So that's what we want. That's looking pretty good. Also, I note here that the seconds hand seems to be running much better, which is great. And so now I'm just going to clean this up and get ready to recase the thing. So I'm blowing out any possible dust and taking a really close look at it just to make sure that there's nothing underneath there. But of course, in order for me to get it into the case, I need to take off the crown. And then this is kind of a cool trick. So you put the case on over the front of it, and then you can just flip it over in kind of one fell swoop and it'll fall into place. Then I like to put in the winding crown again because it kind of aligns the watch properly, or the movement properly within the case. And one of the last steps here are the case clamps. So basically these make sure that the movement stays still within the case and that it's sort of pushed into the right position, because otherwise, you know, when you do things like pull out the crown, or if you're moving around or bump it around, the movement can shift around and the dial can shift around within the case, and that's quite undesirable. So these little tabs basically just hold it in. They're really nothing fancy, but they get the job done. Okay, now we can put the back on it. And there it is, looking pretty good. Now, one thing I did notice though about the watch when I was taking a good close look at it after kind of feeling like I was finished up with the thing, was maybe I wanted to replace the crystal on it. It doesn't look too bad, all told. It's not the original one, I wouldn't assume. But I really do like to replace the crystal on the watch if it has some scratches or dings, which this one does kind of along the edge. And so I'll take a look at that. But first things first, this watch looks really good. I'm really happy with it. And the other thing is we need to see how it performs. So after some tweaking and putting it back on the time grapher, boy, this thing's humming right along. Check that out. It's only losing 3 or 4 seconds a day. You can see it's kind of all over the map. It's not the most consistent performer, but 213 degrees of amplitude is really good. Like, I'm super happy with that. The beat error is 1.3 milliseconds off, and unfortunately that's kind of a weak point for me. That's not a disaster, but that is something I would fix if I could. But I don't really know how to yet. So I'm just gonna have to live with it for now. But it does look a lot better. And like I said, just looking at the crystal, I thought, you know what? I'm just going to get a new crystal for this case. And so I measured it out. And this is the tool that you can use to take off crystals like this. This is just a friction fit crystal. I actually have another thing, like a press by a company called Rober, that will allow it. But I'm just going to use this because it's a little easier. And this also allows you to do it while the watch is, while the movement's in the case. So here I've taken it off, and now there's just no crystal on it whatsoever. And this is a crystal that I got. It's 316, which means it's 31.6 millimeters across. And it's brand spanking new. And a new crystal, boy, it really does kind of bring to life, especially these vintage watches, where you can really see all the cool detail. And, you know, this one has a little bit of patina on the dial, but I like that. I'm one of those people that thinks that it's cool. As long as it's not completely destroyed. And this dial's, you know, it's seen some days, but when it's on your wrist, you don't really notice it. But when you look close, it looks kind of cool. So anyway, you just put the new crystal in this little holder, and then you use the tool to once again kind of pinch it down. And basically just having those little metal tongs on it from all edges can make it small enough so that you can refit it back into the case and then loosen it up afterwards. Just like that. And then it'll kind of just expand out into the little groove that the crystal is supposed to go into. Sometimes I give it a little push just to make sure, but it looks like it's in there nice and good. And there we go. Looking beautiful. So yeah, I love this watch. I recommend picking up one of these. They're usually $300 to $600 on eBay, depending on condition and all that kind of stuff. And it's a great way to get started in vintage watches or whatever, if you're used to it. And boy, what is it, copper movement? Whatever it is gorgeous too. I absolutely love it. And I highly recommend it. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.